The entire cul-de-sac froze when Sharon Wilkins stormed out of her pristine colonial home, clipboard in hand and fury in her eyes. Her target, the rust-spotted Satan Park 18 inches from the curb instead of the mandated 12. She marched across her perfectly manicured lawn, designer sunglasses perched on her highlighted blonde bob, seemingly oblivious to how the neighbors' conversations halted mid-sentence. Everyone knew what was coming. "Excuse me." Sharon's voice cut through the peaceful Saturday morning like a chainsaw. "Do you realize this is a violation of Meadowbrook Estates Covenant, Section 8, Paragraph 3? The young father who had been unloading groceries from his car looked up, confused. This was Dave Chen's first encounter with Sharon Wilkins, HOA board president and self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. The other residents had already started calling her HOA Karen behind her back, though never to her face. "I'm sorry." Dave shifted his sleeping toddler to his other shoulder, clearly trying to process why this woman was advancing on him with a measuring tape. "Vehicles must be parked exactly 12 inches from the curb. You're at 18. Sharon's red lacquered nail tapped her laminated copy of the HOA regulations. "That's a written warning for your file." Megan Williams watched this scene unfold from her porch across the street, sipping her coffee with a mixture of amusement and sympathy. In the 8 months since Sharon had been elected HOA president, property values had risen slightly, but so had the neighborhood's collective blood pressure. "She's at it again," Megan's husband Robert muttered, joining her with his own mug. "Poor Dave just moved in last month. I give him 2 weeks before he gets the full Sharon experience," Megan whispered. "Remember when she cited us for having the wrong shade of beige on our mailbox?" The confrontation ended with Sharon snapping a photo of the offending parking job and Dave hurriedly moving his car while juggling groceries and his still-sleeping child. Sharon turned on her heel, scanning the street for her next target, when her gaze locked with Megan's. Sharon's eyes narrowed slightly before her face transformed into a wide, artificial smile. She changed course and headed directly for the Williams house. "Wonderful morning, isn't it?" Sharon called out, her voice suddenly honeyed. "I noticed your azaleas are coming in beautifully, Megan." "Thanks, Sharon," Megan replied cautiously, knowing compliments from Sharon often preceded complaints. "They're just spilling over your property line by about 3 inches. Sharon pulled out her measuring tape again. "According to the covenant, all plantings must remain within your property boundaries. I'll email you the relevant section." Robert set down his coffee mug with a clunk. "Sharon, they're flowers, not an invasion force." Sharon's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "Rules are rules, Robert. Without them, we'd have chaos. You wouldn't want Meadowbrook turning into one of those neighborhoods, would you?" Before either of them could respond, Sharon's attention snapped to a delivery truck pulling up to the Johnsons' house. "Commercial vehicles aren't permitted before 9 a.m. on weekends," she called out, already moving toward her next target. Megan and Robert exchanged glances. "One of these days," Robert murmured, "someone's going to stand up to her." "And I hope I have front row seats when it happens," Megan replied, finishing her coffee as Sharon began lecturing the bewildered delivery driver about weekend noise ordinances. Little did they know that the confrontation they were hoping for was about to arrive in a form none of them could have possibly anticipated. Colonel James Harrison, retired, moved into Meadowbrook Estates on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, Sharon Wilkins had already slipped 3 separate violation notices into his mailbox. One for the moving truck parked excessively in the street, another for boxes visible through his front windows, unsightly interior presentations, and a third for failing to submit his exterior paint color choices for approval, despite the fact he hadn't painted anything. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Megan said wryly, bringing over a homemade lasagna as James sorted through the pink slips on his porch. At 52, the former Army aviator had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much sun and not enough sleep, but his eyes crinkled warmly as he accepted her dish. "Is this standard procedure?" he asked, holding up the notices. "That's just Sharon getting a head start," Megan explained. "She likes to establish dominance early. 20 years in military service, and I bet you've never encountered tactical operations quite like hers." James laughed, the sound genuine and surprisingly gentle for such a commanding presence. Akhenaton was more straightforward. At least there I knew who was shooting at me. Over the next week, James settled in quietly. He kept to himself, meticulously maintained his lawn, and somehow managed to avoid direct contact with Sharon, despite her increasingly frequent patrols past his colonial-style home. The neighborhood watched with interest. Sharon was collecting infractions, the temporary storage pod in his driveway that stayed 3 hours past the permitted time, wind chimes that exceeded the decibel limit according to her personal measuring app, and a mailbox that was apparently 1 shade too dark. "She's building a case," Robert told Megan as they watched Sharon photographing James' perfectly maintained hedges from various angles one evening. "Remember how she drove out the paddles?" The confrontation everyone anticipated came during the monthly HOA meeting in the community center. Sharon had placed new resident compliance prominently on the agenda, a thinly veiled reference to James. Item 7, Sharon announced, shuffling her papers importantly, as 20 homeowners tried not to fall asleep in the uncomfortable folding chairs. We have a resident who has accumulated 7 violations in just 14 days. James sat quietly in the back row, hands folded, expression neutral. Dave Chen, still smarting from his own encounter with Sharon, glanced sympathetically in his direction. This rate of non-compliance is unprecedented, Sharon continued, bringing up a PowerPoint slide with detailed photos of each alleged violation. I move that we issue an official warning and implement the accelerated fine schedule. Second, chirped Marcia Fleming, Sharon's neighbor and only ally on the 5-person board. Board member Ted Wilson, a retired accountant who usually avoided confrontation, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should hear from Colonel Harrison first. He is present, after all. Sharon's smile tightened. She had noticed James in the back. Of course. Colonel Harrison, would you care to explain your repeated disregard for our community standards? James stood slowly, his posture military straight, but his demeanor relaxed. The room fell silent as he walked to the front, nodding politely to Sharon before turning to face the residents. In my 20 years of service, he began, his voice calm and measured, I learned that good leadership is about clear communication, fairness, and building community. He smiled at the room. I'd received several notices, but no one actually spoke to me. No one welcomed me except Megan. No one explained these rules, which, by the way, contained 17 internal contradictions I've identified so far. He pulled out a folder. I've taken the liberty of noting these contradictions, along with suggested revisions that would make them both more enforceable and more reasonable. Sharon's face flushed red. That's not how we. I'd also like to volunteer for the Community Standards Committee, James continued smoothly. I believe my experience with logistics and regulations could be valuable. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, led enthusiastically by Dave Chen. Sharon's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. The battle lines had been drawn, though only Sharon seemed to realize it was war. Sharon's vendetta against Colonel Harrison escalated from passive-aggressive to outright hostile in the 2 weeks following the HOA meeting. She had never been publicly challenged before, certainly not by someone who had earned the residents' immediate respect. Her authority felt threatened, and Sharon Wilkins did not respond well to threats. She's on a warpath, Dave Chen whispered to Megan as they watched Sharon measuring the height of James' grass with a ruler one Saturday morning. Yesterday, she cited me for having my garbage visible from the street. It was garbage day. The neighborhood watched Sharon's increasingly desperate attempts to find violations at James' property with a mixture of amusement and concern. She documented his mail when it remained in the box after 5 p.m. She photographed a garden hose that wasn't completely coiled. She even measured the distance between his holiday decorations, citing aesthetic uniformity requirements. James, for his part, remained unfailingly polite. He corrected each violation promptly, always with a neighborly wave and a thanks for letting me know, Sharon. His calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate her further. The situation reached a breaking point on a rainy Thursday when James returned from a weekend away to find his driveway blocked by Sharon's SUV. Excuse me, he called out, rolling down his car window as rain drummed on the roof. I need to get into my driveway. Sharon emerged from her house under an oversized umbrella, clipboard still in hand despite the weather. I'm conducting an inspection of the drainage system. Your property has shown signs of non-compliant water runoff patterns. In the rain, James asked, eyebrow raised, while blocking my driveway. This is the ideal time to observe water flow, she replied primly. I'll be done in approximately 47 minutes. James glanced at his watch. Sharon, I've just driven 4 hours. I have groceries in the car that need refrigeration. Could you please move your vehicle? Rules are rules, Colonel, she said, emphasizing his rank with a subtle mockery. The HOA covenant gives the board president authority to conduct infrastructure inspections as needed. Section 12, paragraph 9. Several neighbors had begun watching from their windows, sensing the confrontation brewing. Megan had stepped onto her porch, phone in hand, ready to intervene if necessary. James studied Sharon for a long moment, rain dripping from his jacket. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. You know what? You're absolutely right. Sharon blinked, thrown off by his sudden agreement. Infrastructure inspections are critical, James continued pleasantly. Take all the time you need. I'll find alternative arrangements. He pulled his car away from the curb, leaving Sharon standing in the rain, looking vaguely disappointed at the lack of conflict. The neighbors watching from their windows exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the showdown they had anticipated. Later that evening, Sharon was in her home office drafting a new amendment to the covenant, one that would limit the types of blinds residents could install when her phone lit up with messages. Dozens of them, all at once. Have you seen Harrison's driveway? Tell me Sharon is going to fill it out. Someone called the FAA. Sharon rushed to her front window and gasped. Across the street, illuminated by security lights and the glow of neighbors' phone flashes, was a helicopter. Not a toy, not a drone, but an actual military helicopter parked neatly in James' driveway. It was an old Bell 01 Huey, painted matte black with no military insignia, clearly decommissioned but still imposing. Its massive rotor blades had been folded back to minimize the footprint, but there was no hiding a full-size helicopter in a suburban driveway. Sharon fumbled for her phone and frantically dialed Marcia. Emergency HOA violation at the Harrison property. Get Ted and the other board members on a conference call immediately. Across the street, James emerged from his front door carrying a steaming mug. He stood admiring the helicopter for a moment before glancing towards Sharon's house. Though she was certain he couldn't see her through the curtains, he raised his mug in a casual salute, his face illuminated by the driveway lights. And Sharon could have sworn he was smiling. By 7:30 the next morning, Sharon had assembled an emergency HOA tribunal on James's front lawn. Ted Wilson looked uncomfortable in his bathrobe and slippers, clearly having been dragged from his breakfast. Marcia stood primly beside Sharon, clutching a 3-inch binder labeled Vehicle Violations, while board members Doug Peterson and Anita Gonzalez kept checking their watches, already late for work. This is a clear violation of Covenant Section 5, Permissible Vehicles and Parking, Sharon declared, gesturing dramatically at the helicopter that still dominated James' driveway. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance, many still in pajamas, sipping coffee and watching the show. Dave Chen was openly recording the confrontation on his phone. The covenant specifically prohibits commercial vehicles, recreational vehicles, boats, trailers, and Sharon flipped frantically through her copy of the regulations, and other non-standard transportation devices from being stored visibly on residential property. James emerged from his front door, dressed in pressed khakis and a polo shirt, looking for all the world like he was about to attend a casual business meeting rather than an HOA inquisition. He carried a tray with a coffee carafe and several mugs. "Good morning, everyone," he said cheerfully. "Coffee. I figured if we're having a meeting on my lawn, the least I could do is provide refreshments." The effect was immediate. Doug and Anita gratefully accepted cups, while Ted glanced nervously at Sharon before taking one as well. Only Sharon and Marcia remained stone-faced, refusing the offer. "Colonel Harrison," Sharon began, her voice tight, "are you aware that your vehicle violates at least 17 different provisions of our community covenant?" James nodded thoughtfully. "I suspected it might. That's why I took the liberty of reviewing the covenant in detail last night." He produced his own binder. "However, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Sharon interrupted, "is your apparent belief that military equipment is acceptable in a residential neighborhood." "Actually," James continued calmly, "according to Section 5, Paragraph 3, which you just referenced, the covenant prohibits vehicles from being stored visibly on residential property. This isn't storage." "What would you call it then?" Marcia sputtered. "Temporary parking," James replied. "Just like Sharon's SUV was temporarily parked in front of my driveway yesterday during her critical infrastructure inspection." Murmurs rippled through the watching neighbors. Sharon's face flushed. Furthermore, James continued, turning to a tab page in his binder, "the covenant defines non-standard transportation devices as, and I quote, motorized or non-motorized conveyances not typically used for daily commuting. However, as many of you know from my introduction at the HOA meeting, I spent 20 years as a military helicopter pilot. For me, this was indeed my daily commute." Dave Chen let out a loud snort of laughter, quickly disguised as a cough when Sharon glared in his direction. "That's preposterous," Sharon exclaimed. "A helicopter is not a car." "The covenant doesn't specify cars," James pointed out. "It refers to transportation devices, and Section 5 makes no mention of aircraft whatsoever, an oversight I'd be happy to help correct as part of the Standards Committee." Anita, who worked as a corporate attorney, was paging through her own copy of the regulations. "He's actually right, Sharon. The language is ambiguous at best, and since he's not storing it, just parking it temporarily." "Temporarily?" Sharon seized on the word. "How long do you intend to keep this monstrosity in your driveway?" James checked his watch. "I'd estimate about 39 more minutes. Roughly the same amount of time your vehicle blocked my driveway yesterday." The watching crowd erupted in barely concealed laughter. Even Ted was struggling to maintain his composure. This is outrageous," Sharon sputtered. "Where did you even get a military helicopter?" "It's decommissioned and privately owned," James explained. "A friend of mine runs an aviation museum. We restore vintage aircraft." He glanced at the helicopter with obvious affection. Beautiful, isn't she? Vietnam era, fully restored. Don't worry, she'll be gone before noon. Unless, of course, someone blocks my driveway again. The implication hung in the air like the morning mist. Sharon's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. Now, James said, addressing the other board members, since we're all here, perhaps we could discuss my proposal for revising the covenant language regarding inspection procedures. I've prepared some suggestions that might help prevent misunderstandings in the future. The helicopter incident transformed the power dynamics of Meadowbrook Estates overnight. Where Sharon had once patrolled the neighborhood unchallenged, residents now watched her with barely concealed amusement. Some even dared to wave at Colonel Harrison as he walked his dog each evening. A clear shift in neighborhood allegiances that Sharon noted with growing resentment. This is a disaster, Sharon fumed to Marcia over Lats at her kitchen island. Harrison made us look like fools, and now everyone thinks the rules don't matter anymore. Marcia nodded sympathetically. Did you see the Millers install their bird bath without approval? And the Hendersons have started parking their car in their driveway instead of the garage. It's anarchy. Sharon tapped her manicured nails against her mug. We need to reassert authority. The quarterly budget meeting is next week. I'm thinking we should propose a special assessment for infrastructure improvements. Will there actually be improvements? Marcia asked. Sharon's smile was thin. Of course, eventually. But first we'll need extensive surveys, consulting fees, planning committees. All of which you'll chair, Marcia finished, nodding approvingly. Exactly. Plus, we can increase the violation fees while we're at it. Hit them where it hurts, their wallets. Sharon's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose. Harrison may have won a battle, but I've been running this neighborhood for years. I'm not about to let some military retiree with a helicopter ruin everything I've built. Across the neighborhood, a different kind of meeting was taking place on Megan and Robert's back deck. James sat comfortably in an Adirondack chair, joined by Dave Chen, Ted Wilson, and several other neighbors who had recently faced Sharon's wrath. I don't understand how she got this much power in the first place, Dave said, bouncing his toddler on his knee. The woman cited me for having the wrong kind of mulch. Mulch. It's simple, Ted explained, looking slightly embarrassed. Nobody wanted the job. Sharon volunteered, and we were all too busy to show up and vote. Before we knew it, she'd rewritten half the covenant. James listened thoughtfully. That's usually how it happens. People like Sharon thrive when good people are too busy to participate. Well, I'm not too busy anymore, said Anita Gonzalez, who had arrived late. I reviewed our bylaws. There's nothing preventing us from calling a special election if we get signatures from 51% of homeowners. A hopeful murmur passed through the group. You should run, James, Megan suggested. After the helicopter, you've got everyone's respect. James shook his head. I didn't move here to get involved in neighborhood politics. I just want to restore my classic cars in peace without getting cited for excessive mechanical activity. Classic cars? Robert perked up. Plural James smiled. I've got a 67 Mustang and a 55 Chevy in storage. Been meaning to bring them home to work on. But Sharon would have a meltdown. Dave finished it exactly. Which is why we need structural change, not just replacing one person with another. James leaned forward. What if instead of a single HOA president with broad powers, we restructure to a more balanced committee system? As the group discussed possibilities, none of them noticed the figure standing in the shadows between houses, listening intently. The next morning, residents woke to find bright orange violation notices taped to their front doors. Nearly every household had received at least improper garbage can storage, unapproved plant species, non-compliant mailbox height, excessive lawn ornaments. And on James' door, a special notice, unauthorized gathering exceeding permissible noise levels and attendance limits. Sharon had declared war. By noon, the neighborhood group chat was exploding with messages. Even residents who normally stayed out of HOA matters were incensed. Ted Wilson's wife had been cited for decorative wreath outside approved holiday schedule. The Paddles, who had finally returned after Sharon had driven them away, found a notice claiming their moving truck had damaged community property, with a $500 fine attached. James received 17 text messages before his morning coffee had cooled. When his phone rang, he wasn't surprised to see Megan's name on the screen. Have you seen what she's done? Megan asked without preamble. I have, James replied calmly. It seems we struck a nerve. This is insane. She's fined the Kowalskis for their daughter's wheelchair ramp, claiming it's an unapproved structural modification. James was silent for a moment. Vackie finally said, crosses a line. So what do you now? Megan asked. You said you didn't want to get involved in politics. The quarterly budget meeting of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had never seen such attendance. The community center was packed, with residents spilling out into the hallway. Sharon sat at the head table, outwardly composed but inwardly seething at the unprecedented turnout. Next to her, Marcia nervously rearranged papers while Ted, Doug, and Anita exchanged worried glances. "I call this meeting to order," Sharon announced, rapping her gavel with unnecessary force. "We have a full agenda tonight, beginning with the proposed special assessment for infrastructure improvements." "Point of order," called a voice from the back. James Harrison stood holding a copy of the HOA bylaws. According to Article IUA, Section 2, agenda items submitted by residents must be addressed before new financial proposals. Sharon's smile tightened. "No resident agenda items were submitted by the deadline, Colonel." "Actually," Anita interrupted, sliding a folder towards Sharon, 26 items were submitted. "I received them myself as board secretary." Her expression was apologetic but firm. They were all properly filed and time-stamped. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sharon flipped through the folder, her face darkening. "These are all complaints about recent violation notices," she snapped. "This isn't the forum for individual grievances. There's a proper appeals process, which requires a $100 non-refundable filing fee per appeal," James pointed out. "Given that some families received up to 5 violations simultaneously, that would be $500 just to be heard. That seems designed to discourage due process, doesn't it?" The murmur grew louder. "Additionally," James continued, "I believe we should address the violation issued to the Kowalski family regarding their daughter's wheelchair ramp. The Americans with Disabilities Act specifically protects such accommodations, and HOA regulations cannot supersede federal law." Mrs. Kowalski, a normally quiet woman, stood up. "My daughter Emma was born with spina bifida. We've had that ramp for 3 years with no issues until yesterday." Sharon cleared her throat. "The ramp wasn't properly documented. My husband died last year," Mrs. Kowalski continued, her voice trembling but determined. "We received a violation notice with a $750 fine. I'm a single mother working 2 jobs. Where am I supposed to get that kind of money?" The room fell silent. Even Marcia looked uncomfortable. "I move that all ramp-related violations be immediately rescinded," Ted said suddenly, finding his voice, "and that we create a standing exemption for all disability accommodations." "Second," said Doug and Anita simultaneously. Sharon's knuckles whitened around her gavel. "That's not on the agenda." "All in favor?" Ted continued, ignoring her. Nearly every hand in the room went up. "Motion carries," Anita declared, making a note in the official minutes while Sharon stared in disbelief. "Now," James said, his tone reasonable but unyielding, "I believe we should discuss the recent unprecedented wave of violations that many residents feel were retaliatory in nature." For the next hour, resident after resident stood to share their experiences. Dave Chen displayed photos of his properly placed garbage cans alongside Sharon's violation notice. The paddles presented documentation proving their moving truck had not damaged any community property. Robert Williams had brought a tape measure to demonstrate that his mailbox was, in fact, regulation height. Sharon's carefully constructed authority crumbled with each testimony. When Megan Williams presented a spreadsheet showing the 300% increase in violations since Sharon became president, scattered applause broke out. "This is outrageous," Sharon finally erupted, her composure shattering. "I have done nothing but try to maintain standards and property values in this community. Without proper enforcement, this neighborhood would descend into chaos." Or perhaps, James suggested quietly, we might just become a community again, rather than a collection of infractions waiting to happen. Several people nodded in agreement. "I move that we suspend all recent violations pending review by an independent committee," Anita proposed. "Second," called multiple voices. "And I move that we table the special assessment until we've had proper transparency about what infrastructure needs improvement," added Ted, gaining confidence with each moment. Sharon looked desperately to Marcia, her last ally, but even she was staring down at her hands, unwilling to meet Sharon's eyes. "This meeting is out of order," Sharon declared, slamming her gavel repeatedly. "I am adjourning until—" Sharon Wilkins did not go quietly. The week following the budget meeting, Meadowbrook Estates witnessed what residents would later call the Wilkins Offensive. Her SUV appeared in all hours, patrolling the streets with a singular, desperate determination. She photographed, measured, and documented with the fervor of someone who sensed the rain was ending. "She left another certified letter," Robert told Megan, waving an envelope at breakfast. "Apparently our bird feeder is an unauthorized wildlife attraction that could introduce non-native species to the local ecosystem." Megan sighed, adding it to a growing stack. "That makes 5 this week. She's getting creative, I'll give her that." But Sharon's frenzy of enforcement found little traction. Following the meeting, Anita had drafted a temporary injunction, co-signed by Ted and Doug, freezing all violation notices until a review committee could assess the covenant enforcement policies. Though technically still HOA president, Sharon found herself effectively powerless, which made her next move all the more unexpected. James was in his garage tinkering with a recently delivered '67 Mustang when he heard tires on his driveway. Wiping his hands on a rag, he stepped outside to find Sharon's SUV parked behind his car. Sharon herself was walking briskly toward his front door, not with her usual clipboard, but carrying an elegant leather portfolio. "Colonel Harrison," she called, changing course when she spotted him. "Do you have a moment to talk?" James leaned against his garage doorframe, curious. "Of course. Would you like to come in?" "That won't be necessary." Sharon stopped several feet away, maintaining her composure despite what was clearly a difficult errand. "I come with a proposition." "I'm listening," James replied neutrally. "You've made your point," Sharon said, her voice tight but controlled. "You've managed to turn the neighborhood against me. Congratulations." James shook his head. "That wasn't my intention, Ms. Wilkins. I simply believe in fairness and clear communication." "Be that as it may," she continued, "I recognize when I'm facing a superior tactical position." She opened her portfolio and removed a document. "I drafted my resignation from the board effective immediately." James couldn't hide his surprise. "That seems drastic." "It comes with conditions." Sharon's businesslike tone made it clear this was a negotiation, not a surrender. "I've spoken with a real estate agent. I'm listing my house next week and moving to Valencia Estates. They appreciate proper community standards there." James waited, sensing there was more. "In exchange for my immediate resignation," Sharon continued, "I want all documentation of my enforcement actions permanently sealed. I don't want this situation affecting my reputation in my new community." "I see," James said carefully. "And the other conditions?" Sharon straightened her spine. "The review committee drops its investigation into the HOA accounts during my tenure." That caught James' attention. "The financials?" "I wasn't aware there were concerns about the accounts." A flicker of something: worry, fear, crossed Sharon's face before her mask of composure returned. "There are no concerns. I simply don't want my financial management questioned after I've gone. It's a matter of principle." "Ms. Wilkins," James said slowly, "I have no authority to agree to these terms on behalf of the neighborhood or the HOA board." "Don't be naive, Colonel," Sharon replied sharply. "Everyone knows you're running things now, whether you have an official title or not. One word from you and the board will fall in line." James studied her with the careful assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating threats and opportunities in high-pressure situations. "You know," he said finally, "I never understood why maintaining property values became more important than being good neighbors." Sharon's laugh was short and bitter. "Property values are the only objective measure of success in a community like this. Everything else is just sentimentality." "Is that why you began charging excessive fines and imposing special assessments?" "For property values?" Sharon's expression hardened. "This conversation is over unless you're prepared to discuss my terms." James nodded thoughtfully. "I'll need to consult with the others. In the meantime, I'd recommend against listing your house just yet." "Why?" Sharon's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Because," James explained gently, "if there are financial irregularities, selling your property could be interpreted as attempting to flee responsibility. Just something to consider." The color drained from Sharon's face. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly back to her SUV.